on the schedule. Like I said, we're just preparing for the exam today. No new workbook questions. There is a part 5 and 6 homework to do if you have not done so yet. And there's this really quick preparing for an exam homework. That looks something like this. It's just a real couple quick questions, basically saying things like, have you done all the workbook questions? So don't forget about that guy. It's really quick. Okay, so let's go back to part 6 first before we talk about the exam and make sure we understand how to answer these questions here. So part 6 asked us to solve a bunch of questions about profit margin, and the formula that it gave us in the book was one that assumed everything was converted first, and then we had some subtraction and division. So for example, if I converted my expenses, which are originally in USD, if I converted those to CNY, then it looks like the original formula. Well, how do we get to that point? Well, since our expenses are in USD and our exchange rate is USD per CNY, so both those things have USD on top, I need to divide my expenses by the exchange rate. And therefore, if I go back to that formula that's in the workbook, it actually looks like this if, like I said, if I convert everything to CNY. It looks slightly different if I convert everything to USD, but you get the same answer regardless of which direction you go. So using this formula here, we can plug in the 3 values that were given to us, and we should get that guy right there, if everything works out. Now, the second question was a little bit different. Second question is still asking us about profit margin, but it actually starts by giving us this profit margin and asking us to solve for the exchange rate. And so what I mentioned last time was that you can take this formula that you use for question 1, and you can algebraically solve it for the now unknown exchange rate and figure out the question this way. In the future, we'll figure out a more efficient way to tell Excel how to do this, but for now, algebra is good enough. So if you did not figure out what this looks like after simplifying, you might want to write this down. This is just one way to simplify that formula above, where you're solving for the exchange rate. You have solved for the expenses on top of this giant fraction, and then on the bottom, you have revenue minus revenue times the profit margin. That's one way to solve for it. And there's a few other different simplifications you could use. So like I said, write this down if you didn't solve for this, because I'm not going to send you this spreadsheet because it has my work on it, and I want you to actually do these problems yourself. But if you want me to pull this up again later, just let me know. One thing I do want to point out with this formula, notice that the answer is in terms of USD over CNY. So when you're plugging in stuff to this formula, you need to plug in USD on top. So expenses should be in terms of USD, and CNY on bottom. So revenue should be in terms of CNY. So unlike question 1, you are not converting everything. You need dollars on top. You need CNY on bottom to make these units work out. Also, you can't convert because we're solving for the conversion rate. So do not try to convert stuff for this type of problem. It's going to lead you to a mistake. Now, the last sort of new question was having us create a graph, which looks like this. The workbook isn't worded as well as it could be. We are continuing to use the exact same revenue and expenses from the first 2 questions, but we are using a list of 10 or so different exchange rates. So we are no longer using that 0.1503 from question 1. We are creating a list that varies from 0.1 to 0.2 that we're then using to create a bunch of different profit margins and then graph. So this list, to make this list, you can use that trick I showed you last time where you just write down the first 2 and drag. Well, how do we get this second column? Well, since we're solving for profit margin, it's the exact same formula from question 1. So you can use that again. The only thing that's different from question 1 is that, you're plugging in this exchange rate or this exchange rate or this one. So obviously you should, come up with a formula that you can drag. You don't want to type this 10 times. And then also don't forget that we are using one of these connected scatter plots so that it actually connects the dots for us. And it should look something like this after you zoomed in. It's no longer like a line or anything. It's just has a little curve to it. So that was what we did in part 6. All I wanted to talk about with the rest of the time before I let you work on stuff is what to expect for tomorrow. So let's talk about that. Like I mentioned earlier, our Module 2 exam is tomorrow. And just like the first exam, you will have 60 minutes to work on this. And it's 10 questions once again. And the main difference, though, is that, maybe I should write this down. You only get one attempt. So that's true for the rest of the semester. So don't forget about that. Only got one attempt as opposed to the first one, where you had those 3 attempts. Now, you can start this whenever you want, as long as you're done before midnight-ish. But I still recommend taking this during class tomorrow, just so that I'm guaranteed to be around in case something breaks and you need help fixing it. Like I said, last exam, if you run out of time waiting for me to respond to your email at 10 o'clock at night, I can't go back and fix it. So just a recommendation, up to you if you want to follow that. And there was a question in Zoom about showing my spreadsheet again. I'll pull that back up in a second. Just remind me after I'm done going over this exam stuff. Now, again, just like last time before the exam starts, you are going to have to upload your Module 2 spreadsheet. And this is always the spreadsheet that goes along with the workbook. It's never like my notes or anything like that. So for this one, it was titled Module2.xlsx. Originally, just make sure you have that saved so you can find that before you start the exam next time. The spreadsheet is not graded. We just want to be able to see the work while I'm going back and proctoring these exams, because I can't actually look into what Proctorio records. It's just a picture. So we have you upload these so we can see your code as well. Now, what are these questions going to look like? Well, the majority of these are going to look exactly like questions from the parts 1 through 6 homework. You can ignore the part 0 stuff, but the parts 1 through 6 homework and some of the workbook questions with either no changes or very small changes. So maybe, if there's a question in the homework about euros, maybe on the test it's CNY, or maybe they just change the numbers slightly a little bit. So that is really the best way to start studying or preparing for this exam, is to go over those workbook questions. And if those make sense, and then you can go back through the workbook questions. Now, that's probably 7 or 8 questions on the exam. The remaining 1 or 2 I would consider to be new questions, but they're not entirely new. They're basically things you've done before. The questions are just phrased in a new way. So while you'll have seen the exact wording of 8 of these, 2 of them will be phrased, just slightly different, just so you have to think a little bit more during the exams. Just be aware of that. Now, I already mentioned that. The best way to prepare is going through these older questions. After you've done so, you might also want to create what I call calculators for these homework questions, if you want. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by that in a second. It's a nice way to prepare so that you have some of the work done before you actually start the exam, and all you have to do is change some numbers around. Now, just like the last one, this is true for everything. You can use whatever you want. All these tests are open note, as long as it's not someone else's work and you don't have like some other electronic device open during the exam. But because it's open note and open everything, you want to take advantage of that. Write down anything like the formulas that are potentially confusing. You don't want to have to figure out during the exam, and create nice calculators beforehand so you don't have to build things during the exam. You want to minimize how much time you're spending on like the easy questions, so you can have plenty of time to work on the newer ones. On this exam, this is not necessarily true for every exam, but it is true for the exam tomorrow. You're going to download a new spreadsheet for the last 3 questions. So during the exam, there's a link on the exam where you download a new spreadsheet. So you want to make sure you can repeat any of this stuff that we've done with new numbers. So like if there's a new exchange rate with a new set of units, could you do that during the exam? And if there's a new column of values, could you create a new graph during the exam? Those are the things you want to be able to do if and when we give you a new set of data during the exam. And then all these last 4 things is some common mistakes people tend to make during the exam. So I wanted to just quickly go over those. Make sure you read carefully and enter the correct number of decimal places. If you enter 3 decimal places and the question is 2 decimal places, whole thing's wrong. I can't give you points back for that question. I'm not allowed to. So that's the worst way to miss points during the exam. So if you have extra time, the first thing I would do, even if you only have 2 minutes left, say, just go back and look that all your answers make sense. Okay, this one was looking for an exchange rate. Does that look like an exchange rate with 4 decimal places? And so on and so forth. Be careful not to make rounding mistakes. So definitely always use cell references. And just like I mentioned on the first exam, don't use units. Technically you can if you use the correct units, but there's no reason to use units. If a question is wanting you to have 100 CNY and you're at $100, the whole thing's wrong. So just write 100. You're good. That's all I wanted to mention there. Okay, now last thing I wanted to go over, what do these calculators look like? There's no correct way to do this, but here's just one example. Let's say I'm reviewing for the test and I look at the part 5 and 6 homework question 2, and the random one I get has me start with 1400 JPY, and it wants me to use dealer 1 to convert those to euros. So I got my numbers over there. I start always by writing down the numbers they give me in the questions. I write down 1400, convert those to USD, convert those to euros. Great. Now, if this question verbatim is on the test, maybe it's only 800, all I have to do is change this and I'm done. It took me 5 seconds. That's the goal with these spreadsheets in this class, is we build little calculators like this that do 80% of the test for you. As long as you plug everything in correctly and can find where this calculator is in your spreadsheet. Now, it might not be the case where this exact phrasing is on there. Maybe it's similar, but maybe it has different units. Well, this calculator is still helpful, right? Because you can look at your code and be like, oh yeah, I always multiply by that guy first, and then I divided. And so you can use that to figure out the new version during the exam. Or if you want to, you could really even over prepare and create a calculator for any variation that you might think we maybe use. Maybe we start with euros and then we end with JPY. So here's like an example of a calculator where I can plug in any of these 3 units at the top. I've converted them all to USD, and then I've converted those USD to any of the remaining units that they could ask, at least shown here. So that's another thing you could do with these calculators. And again, it's really nice because you could type in whatever number shows up and bam, you're done. 5 seconds, go to the next question.